Awesome. The doors have closed. Hello, everybody. My name's Rick, and it's amazing to be speaking at GCAP today, just like a proper grown-up developer for the first time. I'm here to talk about comedy and humour in a game dev context, how to use it effectively in games, how to communicate it to players, and also how to maintain your own funny, positive outlook through the gauntlet of getting your game made. And I can't do this without first making it clear that I, myself, and we are by no means the authority on making games funny. Here's just a few of the incredible funny titles being showcased at Games Week. So I just want to acknowledge that we're just one in a number of voices bringing our kind of weird sense of humour to the Australian indie space. You can see there's Dungeon Experience, there's this Cult of the Lamb game, which I'm told is doing all right. Justice Sucks, all kinds of amazing games. So, however, we do, through no fault of our own, come from Sydney. So I guess what I'm here as living proof of is that being funny from New South Wales is still possible. And we have Screen Australia to thank for that. That's down to the assistance that we've received from them. So I just want to commend them for including our ridiculous little game in their selection to receive support, among with all the other amazing games you can play around here. So just a quick thing about who we are. I have to apologise in advance. This deck will contain a lot of footage from our games. This is not so much because of self-promotion. This is just because I'm terrified of having a deck that's just text on screen. So who are we? We're an indie studio from Sydney, New South Wales. We've been making indie games for almost 10 years now. And all of our games typically begin with taking a really weird and unlikely concept and then just pushing it as far as we seriously can and taking it as seriously as we can. Everything that we do is based around what we call chasing the Hojo smile. So it's just this moment where you watch someone playing your game. They could be a gamer or a non-gamer, and there's this little click where you know they've become invested in our characters and our stories, no matter how outwardly silly they might seem to be. So the silly aspect is really a kind of suit of armour we put around the games that we make. And our games are really silly. So these are the three games that we've made to date. We began with Puffington, which is a undersea old-timey platforming game where you're a gentleman pufferfish trying to rescue your worm that you fall in love with from the clutches of the evil Count Eelsworthy. So that was our first game that came out on iPhone. Our next one was Nippy Cats, where you play a bag of catnip and you're trying to save it from an endless swarm of evil kittens. That was on mobile as well. The game we're probably best known for is Inflatality, which is where you're wacky waving inflatable tube men bashing the crap out of each other, fighting for dominion over the human world. And our new game that we're launching at PAX is The Godfeather. You can play it over there. And this is a Mafia Pigeon roguelike where you're tasked with taking back the old neighbourhood from the enemies of your Mafia Pigeon organisation, which is basically anyone who isn't a pigeon. This is the first game we've made that actually has a proper storyline and is significantly more developed than what we've done before. So I wanted to start by let's assume for a moment that we would be capable of making a more serious game and ask the question, given that, why would we still make a game that's silly, or why would we still make a game that's funny? Or be in that kind of satirical headspace. And I think the best way to frame that is to consider it from two angles. So firstly, why do funny games work for indie developers, and why do funny games work for players? So I'll do players first. So why are funny games great for players? Well, the interactive nature of video games automatically suggests, I think, a kind of wish fulfillment. And for comedy, that's usually being some kind of agent of chaos. So I suppose this is a lighter version of the kind of ultra-violent chaos you might find in Grand Theft Auto or something similar. It's a hilarious sort of chaos, and there's nothing else quite like doing that in a video game. You get to be the one causing that chaos. And that brings me to the second point, which is that in a comedy game, just like comedy in general, the protagonist is almost always an underdog. It's almost always an underdog story. And there's a sort of automatic empathy that players will feel towards that sort of character. And that's also why I think with a lot of these comedy games, or what I'm calling comedy games, the protagonists usually aren't human. Because for some reason, humans just aren't as funny in that context. you're much better off being some kind of ridiculous animal. There's sort of an uncanny valley in comedy, I think, in an interactive game. You need to see yourself in the character, but not as that character. And the last point that I'd make here in terms of why players like funny games is that sort of heavy-handed subjects aren't for everyone. I think, especially, like I see hundreds of new AAA or indie games announced every year. And there's an incredible amount of mechanical diversity in terms of genres or art direction and story. But one thing I still feel that they share too much in common with a lot is that they do take themselves a little seriously. And we're interested in the audience for games that don't take themselves too seriously. So that's how we see it as far as comedy for players. In terms of developers, we'll think about what makes a funny game appealing prospect for indie developers. So I'm specifically focusing on indie here because I think it's way more prevalent, these sorts of games in the indie scene. You don't see a lot of AAA games trying to be hugely funny. Generally, they only succeed in being funny when they're not trying to be. So firstly, this is related to the sort of first reason, which is I think that this is probably the only space you can get away with comedy in indie. I think you really can. Making something funny with like a game dev's years-long production cycle, it's risky. It's a risky proposition, and it's hard to guarantee that it'll come off. And I think AAA will always want to cling to more proven paths and methods and things that they know is actually going to be a success or has been a success before. And that's what makes indie dev one of the only truly safe spaces, in my opinion, for surrealism and satire. And when I showed those games at the start from other developers, that's the common thread I think you'll find through is there's always this degree of surrealism to it. And they're both cornerstones of comedy. So almost by definition, indie games are a place where you can obsessively follow a ridiculous idea way beyond its local endpoint or way beyond what the kind of commercial potential of it might be. You can keep that original ridiculous idea unscathed throughout the entire development process. It doesn't have to be focus tested. It doesn't need to have like a grizzled male protagonist holding a gun. It's 100% about your own personal taste and sense of humour. It can be sort of conceptual art, I think, in the truest sense. I also think that this is a more practical consideration, is that for beginners, it's a great medium to learn game dev. So you don't need to create 1,000 procedurally generated planets to make a game that's funny. Some of the most hilarious creative ideas I see over the last few years have actually been on Roblox, where there's almost no barrier to entry and you can quickly throw together any nutso concept to see if there's an audience for it. So when it comes to funny or silly games, it's the idea and the characters that people will notice before they pass judgment on how mature your development skills are. So I think that if you are just starting out in development, going for a funny or silly game is an excellent choice. The last point I'd make here is that funny games usually unlock a broader and more inclusive audience. These are people who aren't necessarily looking for AAA visuals or 100 hours of playtime or 4K ultra widescreen support, although everyone encounters that guy in Steam reviews eventually. Not everyone can relate to a sort of blood-soaked permadeath extraction shooter, but everyone can relate to comedy, and I apologise for anyone who's working on the blood-soaked permadeath extraction shooter. So let's say we want to create a funny game, and it's not something that can be easily kind of broken down into a straight process or a series of steps. So with that in mind, here's finding the funny in 5 easy steps. So obviously, I can't speak for anyone's specific method. I can only, these are just the general columns that I would normally have in place or the process I'd follow if I was venturing into another project like this. And I absolutely want everyone here to disagree with me. We can talk about this later. But I'll go through these steps in the context of the games Hojo have made up until this point. So they are creating the right environment, finding the right creative partner, realizing that your protagonist is everything. You have to make the comedy yours, and lastly, take the silly seriously. So we'll go through each of these one by one. So the first one is creating the right environment for comedy. And any comedian will tell you that there's no way to be funny, but what you can do is put yourself in the right sort of environment to maximize the chance of inspiration striking. So this is very much down to your particular sensibility. It could be someplace calm, it could be chaotic. As a satirist, we generally find being in places or situations that don't make sense work the best. There's a great quote that I love that goes, "Humour and common sense are the same thing moving at different speeds." So humour is just common sense dancing. And I think nonsensical real-world environments are the best place to find funny ideas to make a game about. The next part, obviously, is time, both time and time out from time. This sort of, you can't rush it, you can't force it, so you need time. Games take years to make well, so rushing the conceptual phase, I think, is always a mistake. You have to ask yourself if the idea you've had is funny enough and sustainable enough to carry you through 2 years of hard work, because that's I would say the bare minimum to make a game that's kind of worth putting up. Is the joke that you've come up with worth it? And lastly, you need tools that make you feel creative and tools that you can use quickly. So don't feel you need to dive into Unity to prove out your idea. Do it in Google Docs, do it in Figma, do it in anything that helps you move with speed, because all the hard work and the platform considerations can come later. But with comedy, the most important thing is to maintain that sort of creative momentum. Things have to move back and forth really quickly to find the core of what makes your idea funny. So being a slacker at that phase is absolutely the best approach. Wait until there's something that genuinely inspires you before you start walking in that direction. Which also leads me to the next one, finding the right creative partner. So like I said earlier, for solo devs out there, absolutely disagree with me, but I found that comedy, unless you've got somebody to spar with or bounce ideas off, can be very challenging. So who is your ideal creative partner? Well, I thought about that, and I thought, for me, it's the kind of person that you used to get in trouble with at school. So whether you were making fun of the teacher or you were scribbling weird notes back and forth, those are the sorts of partnerships that create the weirdest ideas and the best work, because you're developing a kind of shared taste for satire at that point. I met my creative partner when we were both working for an advertising agency. So as you can imagine, in that world, the potential for making fun of people or concepts that take themselves too seriously is basically infinite. So this goes to what I was alluding before, which is that kind of unique part of comedy, of any comedy relationship, is the spark. It's not necessarily the amount of work that you put in. It's realizing that there's something magical about the kind of relationship that you have with somebody. You need to be able to spar with your creative partner, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying arguments that you can come out of at the other end without resenting each other. So just call it something different, call it robust discussion or whatever. Have the humility to let the best idea win, even if it wasn't yours. And the last thing I'd say about your comedy relationship when you know it's working is that you feel it's melody and not lyrics. So the rhythm and the momentum of working together is what should propel what you're doing. The comedy almost needs to come from like this third person in the room that's only there when the two of you are together. That's the only way I can describe it. So that's your creative relationship or your comedy relationship. Next thing is your protagonist. So many games are pitched based on their genre. So what I love about comedy games is that they pitch themselves based on the character, the protagonist or the characters. You can't make a good comedy game without a great protagonist, and that's what draws us in every time and usually makes us decide, all right, we're going to start making this game. You imagine a surreal or ridiculous main character, and then you imagine the mechanics and the world surrounding them. So here's some rules that we follow when dreaming up a good comedy protagonist. The first, and this is probably the most important one, is that imagine an underdog character that doesn't belong and then fall in love with them. So you find a character that the world they find themselves in is not where they belong. They should be assuming a role of something 1,000 times more impressive and powerful than they are. And they need to be facing insurmountable, hilarious odds. And that's what will enable the audience to fall in love with your character. It's also super crucial for your protagonist to be totally delusional, or at least in the approach that we take. So whatever joke your game is based around, the protagonist cannot be in on that joke. They need to take themselves super, super seriously. So if you look at, say, inflatality, for example, our wacky wavers genuinely believe that they're locked in some kind of epic struggle to control the fate of the world, just like Mortal Kombat, except they're actually just wavers tethered to the same spot, stuck outside a car dealership, right? So they cannot be in on the joke. In The Godfather, the pigeons are like the most hapless birds you could imagine, but they genuinely think that they're part of an organized crime syndicate that runs the city, and that all that stands between them and total domination is assassinating people through poop. So basically, the more seriously that your characters take themselves, or the game takes themselves, the funnier it'll be. And the last guideline that we always follow is to build the world around the characters, not the other way around. And this conclusion came after a bit of back and forth, but what we always found is that characters inspire the world much better than the settings inspire the characters. So again, if you take The Godfather, we started with Mafia Pigeon. That was it. That was just the core of the idea was just Mafia Pigeon. And the only rule was that the real human world still had to exist. So then we thought, all right, what kind of hideout would a bunch of clueless mafia pigeons build? So then that gave us their roost, which is then populated by the vendors and the kind of other pigeon denizens like the fashion vendor and all of that kind of stuff. All of this just springs from that first idea of the character, and then you build the kind of world around the character. In inflatality, again, the most obvious place for waivers to be is outside a car dealership, but then we started imagining, all right, well, then we come up with increasingly stupid other places that they could be, like a demolition derby or a European club or a medieval fair and all of that sort of stuff. So all of these things just start building out from your original ridiculous character. The next thing is how to make the comedy yours. And what I mean by this is that in other game genres, say crowded genres like a shooter or a horror game or a management sim, there's two ways they can stand out, right? They either have to do the same thing 1,000 times better than their competitors, or they have to offer a completely unique take on the genre. And comedy games face exactly the same issue. How do you make it feel unique? And the good news is with comedy, you already know. It's what you personally find funny. Like that's the way to make your comedy game unique. So it's not just about trying to chase the joke. It's literally about finding what is the thing that I actually find funny, and then you let the comedy kind of emerge naturally from that by exploring the characters and the worlds. It's also worth thinking that, another thing that I'd always say is that every idea you have is a pathway to better ideas, especially the dumb ones. Like you always follow your stupidest ideas. So again, going back to The Godfather, for example, we thought that we had to find some sort of way, some sort of connective tissue between the pigeon mafia and the human world. What were they fighting over? How could we keep it mafia without getting too dark and too serious? And so then we came up with the idea that obviously what they're doing is they're smuggling contraband birdseed back to the old country, right? So that was the core dumb idea of The Godfather. And then that led us to boss fights. That led us to, that's the reason why you're taking Granny out, because she's distributing to your competitors. Becomes the currency in the game in terms of buying upgrades and buying cosmetics, is you're spending birdseed crumbs. That's why you're protecting a shipment in one of the kind of big boss fight levels. So all of these things just comes from following one stupid idea to its logical conclusion. And the last most important part of making a comedy game, I would say, is to take the silly seriously. So comedy is all about the delivery, and this isn't just about the writing. It's in the mechanics, it's in the design, it's in every aspect of the game's development. So as we discussed before, the more seriously the game takes itself, the funnier it will be. I've always stuck to that as the general rule. And that means you can build in depth and surprise wherever you can. So hide stuff everywhere. Like we have a lot of fun hiding things in our games, like small things like coconuts dropping out when you take refuge in a tree, adding areas from The Sopranos with our sort of spin on it, just dumb things, having the baguette kid from BioShock running around the fountain at one point. That there's a tower that's based on Tamworth. So just little things for people to find, because gamers love a treasure hunt in those sorts of things. The other aspect of it is that at least 50% of the comedy is done in audio. So if you're not good at audio, find somebody who is good at audio, because so much of the comedy comes from that. I don't know if you'll be able to hear any of this, but it's little things like, okay, cool. So it's like the glug, 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 glug when you're refilling your poop, or like recording a whole bunch of different sound effects for when people get hit, making sure that that's nice and random, changing the music like to 80s romance when you do a rescue, this sort of stuff. So yeah, all of these things kind of enhance the comedy at the moment. So randomness, yeah, I was talking about randomness before. So yeah, the game features a lot of procedural stuff, like all of the towns are built procedurally, the pigeons can accessorize themselves a million different ways, the billboards in the shops are different. All of this stuff just enhances the general silliness of everything. And the other thing is, the other strange benefit of doing things procedurally is it increases the chance of bugs in the game. Sometimes bugs write better comedy than you ever could, so it's worth leaving some of them in. What else? So yeah, the last aspect that I'd say with comedy games is that Short and sharp work very well for comedy, so you can resist the urge to take on a huge game build. This is connected, I guess, to what I was saying before about if you're just starting out. Comedy games can sometimes be a little less intimidating because you don't need to build 1,000 planets, you don't need to recreate the entirety of Renaissance France, you know, it won't make the game any funnier. So yeah, short games are absolutely fine. So, before I go, I just had a few thoughts and considerations and kind of hard lessons that we've learnt from 10 years of building silly games. I can't say with any certainty that these are objectively true, but these have been our experience. And the first big one is that comedies don't win Oscars. So this movie here is called You Can't Take It With You. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1939. No comedies have won an Oscar since then. So, well, just look, there was a Woody Allen movie, but let's not go there. So what I'm getting at here is that, you know, in video games, as in film, comedy games are a little relegated to being considered a low art. And you could almost argue that video games suffer from that stigma already. So this is a stigma within a stigma. So as with most aspects of indie development, it's best to pre-calibrate your expectations in that area. But the good news is, the saving grace is, audiences love it. Regardless of the recognition you may or may not receive, whether your game becomes a sustaining success or if it's only successful in an expo context, and we've definitely been there before, you'll get a sense of how audiences are responding to it almost immediately. And it's okay to work within a creative niche like this. It's okay for your game to generate a polarizing response. The players who get it will let you know, and it'll feel great. So, in other words, you need to expect to be dismissed as silly, right? Embrace that. You have to enjoy that. If you find someone wanting to make a game for acclaim, then you're making it for the wrong reasons. So if you find yourself making it for that, then it's the wrong reason. So you make it for audiences and make it for yourselves, especially if it's a silly game or a comedy game. Another good aspect of it is that it achieves the impossible. It makes marketing your game fun if you're doing a comedy game, right? So indies, ourselves included, are infamous for beginning our marketing campaigns the night before it goes live on Steam, right? And I've found it's generally for two reasons. One is we're either uncomfortable or unfamiliar with the tactics and strategy of marketing, but also, especially true for creative types, it doesn't feel like fun. You just want to make the game, right? And you just want the show business commission to knock on your door immediately afterwards. You're more likely to enjoy the process of creating promotional content and courting influencers and reaching out to the media and all the rest if the assets in your game are funny to start with. And influencers also are more likely to stream it, right? Media loves something that's funny to write about. So that is actually something that works in the favor of funny games. There's always going to be an interesting angle or a weird take that they can write about if your game is sort of ridiculous to begin with. Yeah, so that's that. Lastly, given that we're here as guests of Screen Australia, I just wanted to briefly cover the experience of pitching a comedy game for funding. This was pretty daunting for us, as I imagine it is for a lot of smaller devs, or especially solo devs. And especially for us, I felt a game like ours, which could be seen as we've discussed, silly or frivolous, was less likely to be considered than, say, a vaporwave cyberpunk racing game or something like that. So we had some amazing help in getting our submission over the line, because it's a hugely different set of skills to game development, but it boiled down to these general points of just things that I'm happy to kind of pass on. Firstly, if you're applying to an Australian funding body, it helps to express how your game's comedy is uniquely Australian and reflective of Australian culture, reflective of Australian diversity. Whether it's the setting or the characters or the type of story you're telling, these are essential components and do not leave them out. The next up is framing the game as a viable commercial investment. So this will obviously depend on the body that you're pitching to, whether it's a publisher or it's a screen body or something like that, but it never hurts to explain how your game would reach its audience and the kind of scale that you're anticipating. And this also applies to the studio itself. They need to see you as an investment as well. So is this your first game or your fourth game? Do you have others in the pipeline? All of this adds up to building a kind of convincing narrative of your journey as a studio. So never sell yourself short on those sorts of things just because the game itself might be silly. And lastly, as I mentioned, we had great help crystallizing all of this into a coherent pitch. There are many people at Games Week around here, probably heaps of them in this room, who specialise in this sort of thing, and I'd be delighted to introduce you to some of them if anybody needs any help there. The most important takeaway here is please never think that just because your game is funny or silly that it's disqualified from funding. That's simply not true. So remember, what you're making is actually art, and all forms of art need support to thrive. And that leads me to last slide, have to end with a pretentious quote. So speaking of comedy as art, I wanted to close with this, which is comedy is defiance. It's a snort of contempt in the face of fear and anxiety, and it's the laughter that always allows hope to creep back on the inhale. So please stay defiant, make silly games that are also art, and above all, have fun doing it. So thank you. Thanks very much. I think I've probably finished heaps early. Oh no, if anyone has any questions or anything. No questions. Oh, cool. Yes, sir.
So games generally have a much longer run time than like a movie or even sketch comedy.
Yeah.
So how do you ensure that the joke doesn't run out, halfway through the playtime?
That's a great question. I think that's probably covered by what I was saying, is it's okay for comedy games to be short. I actually think that's why you don't find many AAA games that are out-and-out comedy games. You might have AAA games that have funny missions in them, like GTA or something like that, but doing comedy from start to finish is a tough call if you're going to ask someone to invest for 100 hours, because I don't think there's a comedy premise in the world that could survive 100 hours of gameplay. So that's why our games are pretty short. And that's why I think indie and comedy go so well together, because, an indie studio probably doesn't have the resources to create 100 hours of gameplay. So yeah, I reckon.
Have you found moving from your shorter sort of single concept games that you were making earlier to The Godfather, which has a story, was there a difference in like the writing approach to like make that last longer?
It's still a pretty short story. By the sense of, when I say it has a more developed story, I just mean it has a story. The other games probably didn't really have much of a story. It was like a beginning cutscene, middle cutscene, end cutscene. I have to say the story was the most enjoyable part of The Godfather, because it was funny. It came together towards the end, and I was like, oh my God, this game has a story. Never written one of those before. But yeah, it wouldn't have worked if it was a long story. Yeah. Yes?
I'm not entirely sure how relevant this question is, but I wanted to ask it anyway. So I feel like there is a place for like these kind of silly, playful, fun for fun's sake kind of games. But I've noticed that like recently in the movies and film, there have been like comedy directors that have been inching towards trying to putting more of themselves and trying to have some message in their comedy. So stuff like Jordan Peele and like Get Out and Everything Everywhere All at Once, which are incredible movies which were really funny but had like a lot of personal heart and like a message that they wanted to share as well.
Yeah.
Do you think that comedy games will kind of have that moment, and is it a case of like, are they wanting people to take them more seriously, or is it like they just feel like it's time to want to express themselves? And have you felt that desire as well?
It's funny. We absolutely have. And I think you can put little messages, but they're small messages. They're not standing on a soapbox type of messages, right? But as far as something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, I think that's really a kind of action drama with comedy. It's not really a comedy movie, right? But it's a good point that there aren't many comedy movies anymore that aren't, I don't know, super genre type things. You know what I mean? It's usually tied in with another genre, and I think that's related to the fact that movies are having a much harder time getting people to actually watch them, So, yeah, but in terms of messages in the games, yes, every time we start a game, we're thinking it'd be nice to get a message into this, but it's always challenging, But yeah, no, it's a good question. Yes?
I think, like, in terms of media and, like, retaining a feeling over, like, the length of a game, I'm thinking specifically horror and stuff like that. It would be beneficial to have breaks in that feeling in order to make you feel it again. Do you have any techniques or advice in terms of doing that in regards to comedy? So, like, creating a serious moment in order to, come back with a swing of comedy
Yeah, I think that it's mostly a kind of budget constraint. I would love to do that. There are moments of pathos or sweetness or various things like that throughout the Godfather story, which, like I said, is very short. If I had the time and development, by time I just mean you need to, as an indie, you probably want to be releasing a game every 2 years. Just to retain your sanity, because it's a big thing to carry for 2 years if there's only two of you or only one of you. So you've got to kind of go for the jugular, I think, to an extent. But that's just been my experience. I think that in other comedy games, like the ones I put up there's probably the kind of tenor and tone of it probably changes all over the place. With our one, it's just kind of silly from start to finish. Oh, yes. Hi.
Thanks for that. Really enjoyable. Quick question regarding a litmus test. Was there a dedicated litmus test when you were throwing concept around inside or external that enabled you as a team to say, let's go with that?
There definitely should have been. I think that the general cycle that we have, right, is that we get a game to prototype, then you bring it to PAX when you have a vertical slice, and then based on the reaction that you get from PAX, because PAX is pretty good play testing, because you're going to get, maybe 200 people over 3 days playing the game. But yes, you can start that litmus test a lot earlier. It depends on how you want to approach it as a creative project. If you want to approach it as a sort of an artist, then, if it makes you laugh and it makes the people who are going to be working on the game laugh, then that's enough, because it's an art project in that sense, right? Even though it's comedy. If you're approaching it with your commercial lens, then yes, you need to at least know that people can play it. We took before we brought the game to PAX, we took it to every available gathering. Amazingly, they still have some in Sydney, and we took it to all the ones we could find to get feedback before we took it to the big gathering, which is over here. But yeah, people responded really well to it. But there was that other thing you have to be careful of, and I mentioned it in the talk, that sometimes you are unwittingly making a game that is hugely popular in an expo context, but doesn't necessarily mean people will buy it. Sometimes games are games that people only enjoy if they're both in the same room playing it. So these are all things you need to watch when you're showing it. Because everyone, if you take it to PAX, everyone's hyped up and excited, right? So everyone is pre-qualified to love your game. No one's going to walk up to your game, play it for 5 minutes and go, that was crap, So you got to make sure you don't get suckered in by that sometimes.
Speaking of sorry, maybe first.
Okay. Yes, sir.
What considerations do you have for doing comedy with regards to single player versus multiplayer versus both experiences?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, say, Inflatality was a local multiplayer game, right? So it was, and because, again, limited budget, limited everything, we could only produce it as local multiplayer, not online multiplayer. So it was really a party game. It was like a couch co-op sort of game. In retrospect, not the best idea because, again, fantastic at PAX when you have a booth and 2 people can play it. But as a Steam prospect, you've suddenly limited your potential audience like crazy because, unless you have friends over, it's not going to work, right? So with Godfather, we went single player because we wanted to actually tell a bit of a story. And I'm actually super confident with single player now. I think it's a fun genre for comedy because it's like a personal journey, like you're watching a comedy movie or something like that. That said, the 3 games that we have slated to begin next year are all multiplayer, so I haven't learnt my lesson there. But yeah, I think single player is obviously safer from a development point of view because if it's multiplayer, it's at least 3 times the work, and unless it blows up like Among Us, you're in trouble. So yeah. You had another question?
You mentioned, games being like an expo game. I'm wondering, how much do you consider streamers when you're designing this game?
For comedy, streamers are literally everything. Like, more important than anything, because it's very attractive to them in terms of the number of times people have played Godfather or whatever, and they might be hobby streamers or they might be professional streamers, but they're always saying under their breath, oh, I want to stream this game, because if you can put something up that's silly, because you think about it as it's like a sugar hit, right? You can throw it in there. It's not some long RPG where the first hour and a half is the tutorial or something like that. It's funny almost from the start. Well, it might be funny, it might not be, but what will happen is the streamer will figure out if their audience likes it or doesn't like it instantly. So it's a very good proposition for them. Throw them a key, doesn't have to be finished, just they just want something to play. So yeah, both Inflatality and Godfeather have done really well with streamers because they love comedies. I mean, apart from streamers who restrict themselves to specific genres, some MOBA streamers or something like a comedy MOBA would be awesome.
Did you like edit your design in any way to accommodate for streamers more?
Not specifically, but it's obviously something you keep in mind. I mean, comedy in general has to be attractive and fun right from the get-go. So that kind of pre-qualifies it for streamers, I think. I don't think a comedy can spend, well, actually, that's, who knows? But in my experience, a comedy can't spend all that much time building up to what makes it funny. I mean, maybe in a stand-up routine, some stand-up comedians can do that, but I think the comedy has to be kind of funny straight away and move pretty quick. And if you have that, streamers will love it. It'll work well on YouTube and Twitch and various things like that. Yes?
So when you're talking about protagonists as everything,
Yeah.
how much of that when building the world do you consider the antagonists?
That's a good question. I think the protagonist will hopefully give rise to the antagonist, right? So by the protagonist is everything, I just mean the first character that you come up with, and then that leads you to all of the other characters that inhabit the world. But the reason why I was talking about not considering the world first is because you have to almost in your mind imagine this character with almost nothing in the background, right? Does it work on its own? The same way that I think Disney animators would tell you, or anyone who's a illustrator of cartoon characters, it's like the silhouette has to work, right? The character has to work even if you haven't painted the lines in, right? So that's what I mean by the protagonist has to kind of stand alone. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Any other questions? Yes?
You said this new game, is it a roguelike as well?
Yeah, that's right.
Are you going to keep the joke from being funny on multiple places?
That's where the procedural element of it comes in. So it's also it has a linear story. As soon as your character is caught by the police or whatever, you go right back to the start. So there's the procedural aspect. There's also huge amounts of customization of the pigeon. So as you play the roguelike, you accumulate crumbs, which you can then spend on any kind of customization you want for the pigeon. And also, once you finish the game, it unlocks a speed attack kind of endless mode with online leaderboards that I did in the last week. So hopefully they still work. Steam leaderboards, they're great. They're really easy to use. Hi.
I was wondering if you had any advice for maintaining a kind of objective stance on your own work when you're sort of working on it for quite a while. So it's easy for us to feel like we're too close to what we're working on.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any advice for separating yourself and analysing what's still fun.
The best way to do that, I've found personally, if you're the one who's making the game, there is no way to do that. So the best way to do it, I mean, unless you're some kind of superhuman who can just, create this version that's objective, I don't think it's possible. What you do need to do then is find people who can be objective. So I'm sort of lucky in that regard that I have a kind of executive producer who works on it who isn't even a gamer, right? So they will just see it purely as, can I sell this? Can I pitch this? Can I do this? Can I do that? Also, one thing is almost a topic of a whole other talk, but around, say, PR and marketing for your game. I come from advertising, which means I'd spent 10, 15 years doing PR and marketing. Then I became an indie developer and suddenly had no ability to do it. And that was because I was too invested in the game, right? You can't write about something. It's very hard to figure out how to promote something you care about. So find some PR people or find one PR person. There's millions, here at Games Week who are terrific. And a good PR person will tell you if the game is no good, right? If there's one who just goes, I love this game, I want to represent it, let's go, they're the ones you want to step back very carefully from. You want somebody who will evaluate it and then come back to you and say, I think we can pitch it as this, this, and this. I think these are the strengths and the weaknesses and all that. So yeah, just as I'm sure all the indie devs in the room will know, you get a million emails from people from all over the world who tell you your game is the best thing they've ever seen, and it's all spam. So yeah, find some people who are super discerning to make that judgment for you. I don't know how to be objective with these things. Hello.
Hi. You have spoken a lot about how you came from a background of advertising.
I'm sorry about that.
No, have you and your team ever thought about making a comedy game about advertising?
Every day.
I haven't done it yet. That sounds funny.
I wanted to create a kind of bizarre Mad Men simulator type game. Yeah, I had that kind of bouncing around my head for ages. So yeah, to take the piss out of advertising would be spectacular because the one group of people who would love it more than anything else are people working in advertising, because they know how ridiculous their industry is, right? So yeah, no, that's a fantastic idea. So when we want to make a kind of management sim type game, because I've never made a turn-based game like that, yeah, that'd be a fantastic idea. Nobody steal it. Any other questions? Oh, hi.
Just on that, so I think one thing that developers can do, especially if they come from different backgrounds, is probably engage with their own personal, I guess, expertise outside of the game development field and put it in a game.
Yeah.
The comedy scene might help personalize it.
Yeah.
In a way.
I
That would bring about more.
I think you have to write about what you know, and I think that even though none of our games are about advertising, the kinds of skills we developed in advertising, this is the horrible deal, the devil's bargain with advertising, right? You get into it, you develop unbelievably powerful skills, and the last thing you learn is that you need to get out of advertising, right? But it really does help. And I think there was a talk, I think it was yesterday, someone was talking about entering indie development from the world of advertising, and I saw that talk and went, that's a fantastic topic. Because yeah, it loads you up with these amazing skills to prototype things quickly, to test ideas quickly. Does it work? Is it funny? Is it generating an emotional reaction? You know what I mean? So it's definitely advisable to use every tool in your arsenal, especially for an indie dev, where it's hard to be seen, it's hard to be visible and stand out. So yeah, definitely. Hi.
Hi again. One more question. I don't quite know how, but it's like with gameplay and polishing that gameplay, the iteration, the testing, the repeatedness, ongoing, to get that polished and tight and satisfying. But then a lot of jokes and a lot of comedy can only really work
Once. Yeah.
And so I guess what's the approach there to being able to polish gameplay and make sure that your gameplay is fun?
Well, I mean, you're hearing the joke 1,000 times yourself, but you're the one who made it, right? The same way that a stand-up comic would practice their act 1,000 times, but the audience who's there hasn't necessarily seen it before. But I don't think it's not... Our games tend to be the kind of the world and the character is funny. It's not necessarily a gag type of thing. There are sort of gags, and every target you get in the Godfeather is like a little mini story, and then obviously when you poop on them or when you rescue the pigeon, when you do whatever, it triggers the funny moment. But I think it's more just an overall air of comedy and just like a silly world. So it's the same with, say, Cult of the Lamb, where ostensibly it's a super kind of dark world, but it's also adorable. That's the magic of it, right? It's this kind of devil worship world, except you're this adorable little lamb. So that's the juxtaposition that brings the comedy. You will just polish and polish and polish until it expresses the funny thing you're trying to get across as readily as possible. And then when you show it to people, you can see if they get it or not. Yeah. Welcome. I think that's it. So yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, everybody.